Hello and welcome to Sophie & Co. I'm Sophie Shevardnadze. How did Russia and the West slip back into what seems like the Cold War all over again? And how is this standoff affecting Americans? Well, today we ask someone renowned for his insights. A man of many talents, American linguist, philosopher, cognitive scientist, political commentator and activist, a major thinker of our time. Noam Chomsky is my guest today.
The United States is back in a familiar conflict. The Russians are the enemy once again. The rhetoric is heating up. The resurgent hawks are getting louder. Who benefits from the constant saber rattling? How can it be stopped? And is anyone prepared to go from words to action?
Professor Noam Chomsky, world-renowned linguist, philosopher, political commentator, joining us via Skype from his MIT office. Professor, it's really great to have you with us today. Now, today, U.S.-Russia relations are at a Cold War low. Rhetoric resembles what we heard in the 80s. What is the worst-case scenario we could see this turn into? Can the Cold War turn hot? Does U.S. want war?
The worst scenario, of course, would be a nuclear war, which would be terminal, both for the state that initiates it, which would be wiped out by the consequences, and that's the worst case. And it's come ominously close several times in the past, dramatically close, and it could happen again by not planned, but just by the accidental interactions that take place, as has almost happened. It's worth remembering that just 1 century ago, the First World War broke out through a series of such accidental interchanges. The First World War was horrifying enough, but the current reenactment of it means the end of the human race.
President Obama came to power promising to work towards complete global nuclear disarmament. Well, now there is plans to spend $1 trillion on nuclear arms in the next 30 years. Well, with major powers only acquiring more nukes, it's only obvious that the others will want as well. So could we see the nuclear non-proliferation regime crumble in the near future?
We can think back as far as 1955, when Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein produced an appeal, a joint appeal to the people of the world, in which they said to all of us, you have a choice that is stark, unavoidable. The question is, will you eliminate war, or will you eliminate the human race? Those are your choices. And we've come awfully close several times since. The missile crisis in 1962 was described by Kennedy's associate historian Arthur Schlesinger as the most dangerous moment in history. He was quite right. Came very close to nuclear war. There have been many cases, not that serious, but pretty close, where a few minutes, human intervention with a few minutes choice has prevented a nuclear war. You can't guarantee that that's going to continue. It may not be a high probability each time, but if you play a game like that with low probability risks of disaster over and over again, you're going to lose. And now, especially in the crisis over Ukraine and the so-called missile defense systems near the borders of Russia, it's a threatening situation.
Mm-hmm. Professor, U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel said the U.S. needs to deal with Russia's army on NATO's doorstep. But as you yourself put it, America's red lines are firmly placed at Russia's borders. What are American red lines doing on Russia's borders?
Well, his statement was interesting. Of course, he's correct. But NATO's borders have been expanded to reach Russia's borders. This takes us back to the collapse of the Soviet Union around 1990. There was an agreement between Gorbachev and President Bush, Bush #1, that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That meant to East Germany. That was the agreement. As soon as the agreement was made, NATO was expanded to East Germany. Gorbachev was naturally infuriated, but he was informed by President Bush and his Secretary of State, James Baker, that this was only a verbal agreement. There was nothing on paper, which is true. There was nothing on paper. And Gorbachev had no choice but to accept it. And President Clinton came along, next president, and within a couple of years they expanded NATO even further. In fact, one might ask why NATO even continued to exist. The official justification for NATO was that its purpose was to defend Western Europe from Russian hordes who might attack Western Europe. You can ask how plausible that explanation was, but at least that was the official explanation. Well, 1990, 1991, no Russian hordes. Natural conclusion, okay, let's disband NATO. The opposite happened. NATO expanded. Its mission changed. The official mission of NATO, became to control the global energy system, sea lanes and pipelines. That means to control the world. And of course, it's a US-run intervention force, as in Kosovo and Serbia in 1999. It's a US-run intervention force. That's the new NATO, and it did expand to Russian borders. So Hegel is correct that Russia is on NATO's borders. But it's as if the Warsaw Pact had expanded to Mexico and Canada, and then the Russian premier said, well, the United States is on the Warsaw Pact's borders, which would have been true, but a little bit misleading.
Watching and reading the US media, it's hard not to be surprised at the calls for war in one form or another. I mean, there are wordings like red lines, no options off the table, lethal aid, troops on the ground, and all of this is presented like it's no big deal. And not only in the press, but by the government officials as well. Now, you are a scientist of words, of mind. You are, a political activist. What do you make of it? Why are Americans apparently so ready to go to war?
Well, I don't think they're ready to go to war, but the commitment to sort of control the world is very strong and pretty natural. After all, this is the one global superpower. And this incidentally goes way back. So the peak of American power in history was around 1945. In 1945, the United States literally had half the world's wealth. And very naturally, American leaders wanted to design and organize a world system which would benefit primary domestic centers of power. That essentially means the U.S. corporate system. The origins of the multinational corporation began to develop at that time, abetted by the Marshall Plan and so on. And there were detailed plans for assigning to every part of the world what was called their function within the global system. That began to collapse very quickly. There's a lot of talk these days about American decline, which is correct, but it's rarely recognized that the decline began at once. In 1949, there was a serious blow to U.S. global hegemony, China's independence. There's a name for that in U.S. history and Western history. It's called the loss of China. But just think about that phrase for a minute. Loss of China. I mean, I can lose my computer. I can't lose your computer, right? I can only lose what I own. And the assumption, the tacit assumption is we own China. We own the world. So if any part of it becomes independent, there's the loss of China, or the loss of Indochina, the loss of the Middle East, and so on. However, it's worth recognizing, going back to your comment, that there is criticism of this in very prestigious places. So the leading establishment journal in the United States is Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. That's as central to the ruling dominant establishment as you can get. Their last issue, the lead issue advertised with letters on the front page, was an article by a well-known international relations specialist, John Mearsheimer, with the headline something like, "The West is responsible for the crisis in Ukraine." And it's a critique of Western, meaning US policy, that has driven things to the point where there is a serious crisis in Ukraine, a crisis that, as Mearsheimer points out, seriously affects Russian geostrategic concerns and would do so no matter who was in charge of Russia, just because of the geostrategic nature of the circumstances. Well, that's right in the main establishment journal, the lead article. So it's not that this is going on without critical discussion. There's some, not enough, I think, but some.
Professor Chomsky, we're going to take a short break right now. When we're going to come back, we'll continue talking to world-renowned academic Noam Chomsky. Stay with us. Professor Noam Chomsky, philosopher, cognitive scientist, political commentator, joining us via Skype from Boston. Welcome back to the show. Russia's Vladimir Putin says the West can't isolate Russia through confrontation and sanctions. What do you think? Is he right?
It can't isolate Russia. It could cause serious harm to Russia, but what it's likely to do, and it's beginning to do, I'm not the only one to point this out because it's obvious, what it's doing is driving Russia towards the east, towards closer relations with China. There's plenty of hostility way back in China and Russia, but there are also some common interests. And the sanctions and other pressures against Russia are almost compelling Russia to move towards closer relations with China. China is the center of what's called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a very substantial international system based in China, which includes India, includes Russia, includes Pakistan, includes the Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and others. Big international system. The current U.S. policy is driving Russia towards closer interaction with this Chinese-based system. In this interaction, Russia is actually the weaker partner, so it's making concessions. But the U.S. is openly creating a system of power which could significantly diminish U.S. domination of the world. Now, this is a confrontation that's going on all over. It's part of Obama's pivot to Asia. There's a Trans-Pacific Partnership, so-called, the huge commercial treaty designed to incorporate the Asian countries, not China, but the other Asian countries, crucially not China, including Japan, Australia, probably India, the southern hemisphere, Chile, Brazil, and so on, in an enormous trade pact. Exactly what it is, we don't know because it's being kept secret. These things are negotiated in secret, then given to the parliaments to sign, yes or no, meaning yes, no discussion, no choices. So it's not a sure thing by any means, but that's the plan, and it's the kind of economic counterpart to the military pivot to Asia, and the sanctions on Russia are helping to create a counterforce based in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or an extension of it, which will include Russia, and may begin to move into across the whole Eurasian region, first to Turkey, then to parts of Western Europe, which have their own close relations with Russia in the East, Germany in particular. I think those are things that are developing, and the sanctions are part of it.
Professor, I want to talk about the crisis around ISIS a little bit. You've said that the appearance of ISIS and the spread of extremism is a natural consequence of U.S. actions in Iraq. But the emergence of ISIS seemed a surprise to all. How did U.S. intelligence miss it?
Well, I'd suggest that you look up on the internet a recent article by Graham Fuller. He's a very highly regarded commentator on Middle Eastern affairs, coming straight out of the U.S. establishment, a long background in the CIA as an analysis, and a highly respected and very knowledgeable commentator. What he says is, I'm quoting him, the United States created ISIS. And then he goes on to say the U.S. didn't plan ISIS, of course, isn't implementing it. Those conspiracy tales have no basis. But the U.S. actions in the region, particularly the invasion of Iraq, that created the circumstances under which ISIS emerged. And I think he's correct. What happened is the U.S. basically hit Iraq with a kind of sledgehammer. U.S. forces instantly instituted a governmental structure which was sectarian in nature. In particular, there were the Paul Bremer, the kind of viceroy of Iraq, designed a system in which there were participation by Shiites and Sunni in various proportions, but it had to be divided that way. That, along with the counterinsurgency operations, of course, resistance to the invasion, which the counterinsurgency operations, as always, were very brutal and destructive. All of this came together to create sectarian conflicts, which had not existed before. If you look at Baghdad in 2000, Shiites and Sunni were intermarried, living in the same areas. They often didn't even know who's a Sunni and who's a Shiite. It's kind of like knowing which Protestant sect your neighbor belongs to. You may not know and you may not care. You look at Baghdad 10 years later, 5 years later, it's broken up into separate regions, walled off from one another, brutal military conflicts, much of the population expelled. That has since expanded. By now it's tearing the whole region apart. Syria is one element of it. The Iran-Saudi confrontation is another aspect of it. And out of this emerged ISIS. Graham Fuller is quite correct.
You just quoted a man that you respect a lot who said that it's the United States who involuntarily actually created ISIS. So if it's the United States actions that brought about ISIS, isn't it only fair that the United States should lead the fight against it today? I mean, it's only obvious the political and diplomatic means to solve this mess aren't there. So do you support the US-led bombing campaign?
There are ways to respond diplomatically. The one conceivable possibility, is to act in accordance with the law. There is a reign of international law that's the principle. It bars the use of force or the threat of force in international affairs, except under authorization by the UN Security Council. A law-abiding state would go to the Security Council, ask for a declaration by the Security Council of a threat to peace, and request the Security Council to organize and direct a response to it. And that could be done. The U.S. could then participate in it, but so could Iran. Remember, you look at the Iraqi Foreign Office, what they want is for Iran to become involved. It's a major military force. If it did enter, it would probably wipe out ISIS in no time. But the U.S. won't permit that. The U.S.-run coalition, which is in violation of basic international law, excludes Iran, excludes the PKK and its affiliates, which apparently are doing the ground fighting. According to the U.S., they're a terrorist group. Turkey, which is the closest U.S. ally, is opposed to them. The central U.S. ally, Saudi Arabia, is actually that's been the source of both the funding, the main source for the funding of ISIS, but also it's the ideological source. It's the Wahhabi, Salafi extremist, radical Islamic doctrines, which are kind of a fringe of Islam, that's Saudi Arabia. A fringe of that radical doctrine is ISIS. So this coalition is, it's kind of a meaningless coalition apart from being illegal. There would be ways of handling of at least approaching the problem legally, which could work.
Mm-hmm. And just my final question on a different topic. The FBI is now looking into an apparent second Edward Snowden, but previous whistleblower revelations have failed to make any real dent in the system. Why would this be any different? Talking about NSA spying isn't stopping NSA spying.
It's not stopping NSA spying. It's not stopping the spying being done by Britain. The spying being done by France, the spying being done by other countries. I'm sure Russia's doing it. The states are very resistant to interference with their powers. Of course, the NSA system, the U.S. is far and away the technologically most advanced country in the world, so these are more extensive in the United States, but it's duplicated in China, and Britain, Russia, no doubt, other countries. And yes, you're right, it hasn't stopped. Well, in fact, it's expanded. It's a real major attack on human rights. And the major threat is that if it becomes sort of tacitly accepted because of the fact that it's not stopped, it's just going to go on. It'll go on to the point where there are literally, tiny drones, fly-sized drones, that can be on the ceiling of your living room, listening to what you're saying and sending it back to the central government office. Now, there are no limits to this. Already, if you have a cell phone, even if it's off, you can be tracked by NSA and other technologies. So this is a really dangerous development. Snowden made a major contribution by exposing it, but there's a long way to go. There has to be a citizen reaction which will put an end to these practices.
Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for this interview. We were talking to world-renowned academic, American linguist, thinker, activist Noam Chomsky, talking about what's in store for Russia-US relationships, also crisis around ISIS, and is the next whistleblower scandal going to be any different than Edward Snowden? Thanks a lot for this interview. That's it for this edition of Sophie & Co. We'll see you next time.